Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm very glad you're here. Juggling things here. My name is Porter Anderson. I am the editor-in-chief of Publishing Perspectives. We are the international news medium created by Frankfurter Buchmesse. And our specific direction of coverage is toward the international industry. We hope you'll read us online whenever you can, and do join us in our Publishing Perspectives Forum, which is over in the Congress, when you have a free minute. Not now, stay with us here, because we have a cycle of talks, panel discussions, and executive talks going all day today and all day tomorrow. We'd love to see you join us. What we're doing today here is very important and very interesting, and I'm delighted to be a part of the hour that we're going to spend together. The LIA Foundation has been created by the Italian Publishers Association, AIE, the president of which is Riccardo Franco Levi, and a very fine fellow, who also is the vice president of the Federation of European Publishers. And it is also supported and was co-created by the Union of the Blind in Italy, the Italian Blind Union. And what they have done in creating Fondazione LIA is bring us something that specifically and in a very dedicated way studies the needs of those who are disabled to some degree and in one way or another. You may be familiar with the Marrakesh Treaty, which was created under the auspices of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. It's a marvelous treaty that, in fact, creates a copyright exception so that a great deal of literature can go to people who need help reading because of limited sight, in some cases limited hearing and sight. It's a fabulous program. And it lets a lot of good literature that normally would not have reached such people get to them. We're going to learn a good deal more here in a short slide presentation that I'll talk you through before we start hearing from our guests. And so let me switch hands here. Whoop, sorry. I'm just going to put those there. Let me do this so that I can get us going through our slides, and then we'll discuss the issues here. Let's see. Right, here we are. First, we're going to talk about the people who need the kind of work that the LIA Foundation does. As you can see here, there are a great many people who are struggling with their inability to read as you or I might, to take in literature, to understand their culture around them because of it. This is not a small group. As you can see from these facts and figures, it's a large group. According to the European Disability Forum in 2019, there were over 100 million people with disabilities in the European Union. And one of the things we're going to look at, as a matter of fact, is the new legislation coming out of the EU that has to do with exactly this. The World Health Organization is looking at, in Europe, 2.5 million blind people. You see these numbers, they're just huge. You don't realize this until you actually sit down and start looking at these numbers. It's quite extraordinary. The survey that LIA has done gave us a great deal of information, and some of that is, of course, feeding what we're doing today. You'll find the intelligence of those results feeding into and informing a great deal of what we know. What I found fascinating when I looked at these figures for the first time is how many more visually impaired people are actually reading than are regularly gifted people, people who are normally sighted, particularly in the Italian culture that they were looking at here through this university study, are not reading as much as their colleagues who are in some way impaired, which is fascinating. Now here is the EAA, as we call it, the European Accessibility Act. We won't go into all of the details because they're a bit granular, but what it does is say that by the year 2025, this thing will come into force, and all of the nations are now in the stage of harmonizing, as we say, their legislation to match the work coming out of Brussels, saying these are the points you must hit, these are the accommodations you must make, these are the things you must guarantee to the citizens of the European Union. I will tell you we're jealous of this in the United States. This is something we don't have at this point and would love to see happen. We have many things going in the right direction, many things going in another direction, but this is not something we're working on as seriously as we need to, and I hope that we will follow this lead ourselves across on the other side of the Atlantic. Here are the dates. As you can see, we are, as I was saying, we're in the harmonization period, and then it is in June of in the summer of 2025 that everything must be arranged. If you have any questions, it's very good to look now at this legislation and find out just exactly what your responsibilities are. If you are working in anything close to this milieu, make sure that you're prepared so that when the time comes, you're in sync. We're looking for, I love this phrase, an accessible publishing ecosystem. That's a really fine way to put what this is, because many of you, I think, may have heard of Born Accessible, a term that has come out of a lot of the research and the development of ways that publishing can work toward developing and creating books that are from the get-go, as we say, from their very inception, ready for use in accessible formats all the way through. So it's not an afterthought. You know, it's not a matter of tweaking something here and changing something there, different color there. No, no, no. This needs to be thought of at the very beginning, and in doing so, that's when you create that ecosystem. Only starting at the beginning with a project can you really be fully covering the waterfront and getting everything right. These are some of the facets of it, as you see, and I like the fact that in this particular chart, the oval gives us a feeling of a kind of cycle that in turn gives us that idea that it never quite stops. Working in Born Accessible ways means that you are at every point thinking of that. Even at the end of one project, you're thinking of it at the beginning of the next one, in other words. And I think that this is something that you'll hear more about too as we speak with our guests. Each player has a part, and each player must play that part. It's not only a matter of getting, for example, one publishing house to think about this. It's getting the vendors to think about it. It's getting the distributors to think about it. Even the booksellers, or especially the booksellers, need to think about it. They need to know, what have I got available for my customers who need this kind of material? Who do I get it from? Which publisher can give me this, which can't? Which distributor knows what I'm talking about when I say I need accessible literature in my bookstore? Which distributor doesn't know? I'd like to know if you want to tell me which ones don't. It's a point where we've really got to do this. We need to move forward, as we're saying, I think, a lot in terms of the climate crisis. The time for talk is over. And we've gotten to a point where, at least from the journalistic viewpoint, that's how I come in on this, we can tell that it's time to get this done. We know how, thanks to all of the background research and to the work of the foundation and several organizations like it. We know what needs to be done, and we know how to do it, and we're going to help you understand that in case you are not fully familiar with it at this point. And so that is our quick understanding of where it is. That's our context, a little bit of an idea of what we're going to talk about. And we're going to begin with Christina Musinelli, who's with me here, and who's going to tell us the background on where this is coming from and the actual technical stats of where we are in the industry with it. Could you lead us off on this, please, Christina?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to see a lot of people here. It's very important. Just a few information. As was explained, the legislation required that people with disability should be able to access the same catalog of any other reader in the same time, with the same format and with the same distribution channel. So it's a completely different mindset. It's a paradigm shift. What is really important is to start working on the standard. There are standards defined by the publishing industry that are already available to create this kind of new ecosystem. There are standards for the format like EPUB. There are standards for metadata like Onyx and Schema, and it's possible. We, as LIA Foundation, work with more than 76 publishing imprints in Italy, and we were able, working side by side with them, to make them able to create born accessible publication for the new title. We now have a catalog of more than 30,000 titles that were born accessible, and this is very important because as the legislation will come in force in 2 years, it's important that the new titles are already accessible since the first publication. It is possible using the standard production tool like InDesign or other that you may use to include the accessibility feature within the production of the book and not afterwards. And this is really, really important. Then there is also the need to distribute this content in the value chain. And so, as explained before, all the actors are required to comply with the legislation. So not only the publisher, but the retailers, the online store, the reading solution, and all the actors. And this is very important, and they must be aware of what accessibility means. This is why we, as LIA Foundation, have a program that is a certification program where we test all the files created by the publisher, and we give them a logo that can be displayed on the retailer website and with the metadata, so the people can know that the title is accessible, and they can also know the specific characteristic of the title. So if they have to buy a title, they can buy a title that they know is exactly what they need and what they want. The other thing is the backlist. There is the need also to convert the old title and to make them accessible. There are some different options for this. There are also some exemption for the micro-enterprise in the directive, but it's also for sure another big issue. We will discuss it later also in another meeting that it will be held in the intent room, so you're welcome. And Anne Bergman from EPP will address the issue. And this could be costly. It could be, it could take a long time, but it's absolutely important to do, and the publisher need to be aware of this and need to start evaluating for which title is absolutely crucial to be accessible in comparison not only with the cost they have, but with the advantage for the people who are blind or visually impaired. The last but not least is the fact that training is a crucial point. In the legislation is explicitly written that the lack of time, lack of knowledge, lack of priority are not considered as an excuse not to be accessible. So what we do as the LIA Foundation, but as other organizations, we have a complete catalog of training courses that address all the different elements in the production and distribution process. But what I think it's very, very important to highlight, accessibility is a culture. It's not something that you put just at the end, something that you don't consider since the beginning. It should be a culture of the company, as sustainability, as greening, as all these new important topic, and also should be something that evolve according with the evolution of the technology, the evolution of the standard, and the possibilities that new technology offer to people with disability. When we started the foundation, it was impossible, for example, to have the Android device with accessibility functionality while the Apple one had them. Now you can have the same kind of functionality on both of them. So this is also very, very important. And the other very important remark I think it's important to say is accessibility is quality. If you create accessible website, publication, and app, the product you produce and the service you offer are better for every reader, because accessibility means that you have a structured content, that you have all the information that you need. So it's really, really important that you take this in consideration. We are for sure available for any information more in detail that you may need. Thank you. Or for question afterwards.
Thank you, Christina. I certainly appreciate your comments. I think that in the practical reality, it's also good. It sounds like a rather crass thing to say in some ways, but this is a wider market for you too. There is more to be had, and in the same way that our industry has not always been good at marketing to men and boys as it does to our wonderful women and girls who read. There are people who are hungry to read, and they want accessible literature. And a good way to think about it is the widening of your own marketplace and your own access to more and more readers. This is a perfectly good business proposition and a good thing to think of in those terms. Speaking of business, I'd like to turn to Stacey Scott, who is going to speak with us about the work that's been done at Taylor and Francis. And I think, Stacey, it's image description and the guidelines and involvement of authors as well, right, that you want to tell us about?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
I'd love to, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming to the session. It's wonderful to see everyone in person at Frankfurt 2022. So as Porter kindly introduced, my name is Stacey Scott and I am the Accessibility Manager for Taylor and Francis. I'm also the Chair of the Publishing Accessibility Action Group for the Publishers Association UK. That's quite a mouthful. Through these roles, I have come into contact with many publishers, and in my past life as the service lead for RNIB Bookshare. So as you can imagine, the plethora of accessibility issues is vast, but one of the key things that I work on daily is image description. And I'm going to come to that in a second, but I just want to paint a bit of a picture, if I may. I'm going to paint a picture of words to you, very appropriate for the topic. So I myself am blind, and I've always been blind. I have had no useful vision throughout my education. So when I went to university, I found myself really struggling to decide what subjects I could take based on what was available to me in accessible format at the time, but also, disregarding those subjects that maybe seem too visual or with far too many pictures or visual elements. I did decide on a maths degree, which I do admit does have its visual elements to it, but I walked into an exam, and in order to do my exam, I had Play-Doh, and I had pipe cleaners, and beads, and coins, and I had to make very, very kind of Blue Peter, if you're familiar with that, very Play-Doh sort of childlike style of very complex graphs that would then be drawn by somebody else exactly as I'd done them to be submitted as work. And it was very hilarious walking in and having the examiner sort of go, do you know where you are? This is a maths exam. I was like, I know, I've got this. But it would have been much easier if I could have had some image descriptions and didn't have to rely on people making things out of plasticine for me, as much fun as it was. So with this bit of knowledge and hopefully a bit more in my professional life, I joined Taylor and Francis and help lead the charge on putting alt text into our work and making it what we would call, born accessible and fully inclusive. We very much, we talk about accessibility, but very much as a stepping stone towards inclusion for everybody. So one of the key things that Taylor and Francis decided, and this was back in 2018, when the EAA was being considered, when things were starting to ramp up a bit in terms of accessibility, Taylor and Francis thought, okay, we started to make accessible EPUBs, we're doing all that, but actually what are we doing about these really visual elements of our texts, which are, of course, pictures without description? And so Taylor and Francis put together what we call now our accessibility working group. And that was the first step. It was building a network of internal stakeholders who were at a variety of different levels across the business, who would come along once a month and say, okay, we're going to work this out. We're going to actually plan this through, and we're going to build a project proposal, a business case, to take to the executive leadership team to say, this needs to be done. And so that involved, as you can imagine, a lot of research and looking at actually, how would this benefit us as the publisher, but also how would it benefit our customer base? And as Porter said, there is such a thing as the purple pound, the pound that a disabled person is not spending because your offering is not accessible. And with the numbers of people with disabilities and print disabilities on the rise, that purple pound is getting bigger every single day. And so it is an important factor, but it's also important to think about, we wanted to think about, but we want to embrace all of our customers. We want to be inclusive. We don't want to be somebody that says, well, we haven't bothered. We haven't got round to it yet. And so part of the process, as I say, there was some competitor analysis, which essentially involved working with our partners and making sure we knew, what they were doing, we shared what we were doing, so that we built that community. And that is where the group that I'm a chair of, the Accessibility Action Group, comes into it as well. It's a community of publishers who do not compete in making their content accessible and inclusive. We're more than happy to share the work that we do. We're more than happy to partner with anyone to make it as good or to near perfect as we can get it. So in part of this process, one of the key things that we had to consider was, what do we want our deliverables to be, and who do we want to actually describe the images? And so that was a really important question. So we do have images described by our vendors, and we have images described by people in-house. But we actually started thinking about images that actually were, how could we streamline this process a bit more? And so we decided to look at author-born image descriptions, where we would get the authors to describe their own images when they were submitting their manuscripts. And it was a really interesting concept, but the exec leadership team were fully on board. But could we get the authors to get on board? That was the big question. And so we decided that actually what we needed was a bank of tools that really fully supported the author in this journey. And so our outputs include a fully detailed step-by-step process detailing what alt text is, what the benefit is, and how you can write it. And that comes along with several descriptions of all different varieties and different subjects to give examples to authors as to how they could write their alt text. How many words does it need to include? How should it be worded? How long does a description need to be? And all of that guidance we put together so that the authors could easily access it. And we also have a feedback page. And so when authors submit their alt text or their described images to us, we quite often ask them to give us a sentence or two, if they will, how they found the process. And actually, it was really, really interesting because so many authors said it's not that they didn't want to do it, it just didn't occur to them to do it. Or perhaps they thought the publisher did it, or there just wasn't a need for it. And actually, a lot of them found it was a really enjoyable process, and they learned a lot about how to actually explain things, not only to the person with a print disability accessing their work, but also to their wider audience. And so we've had a lot of feedback that it's been quite the journey for authors as well. And the number of books, we're currently about 1,500 described books at the moment, and that number is growing exponentially, which is absolutely fantastic. Another key resource with that is making sure that we support our editors to give them the tools that they need to support the authors with any questions or help that they may need in order to write those image descriptions. Another key thing that we found with those descriptions is that for some things, if you're describing Paddington Bear, it might be that we can all take a stab at describing Paddington Bear to a reasonable degree. But if you're describing a complex equation or some subparticle that it's going to be quite technical for a lot of people unless you are fully immersed in that subject. And so there are some subjects where actually only the author can do the image justice. And we've really felt that particularly across our STEM titles, so our science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine titles. We've really felt the benefit of that, of having really, really knowledgeable people, obviously the author who drew the diagram and who's working on that piece of work, having them describe it made a huge amount of difference, because sometimes, I'll be honest, we're looking at it going, no idea what that is, no idea. It's some sort of molecule, but that description's not going to cut it if you're reading advanced chemistry. So having that in place was really important. The reaction's been great. We want to continue to support our authors. We want to continue to work with our partners to look at what they're doing. In terms of moving forward, we would want to look at, we'd want to look at getting a lot more involved, I think, putting out there a lot more about what our authors are doing, sharing practice even more, and working with our partners. But it's certainly been a really interesting journey, and I think it's certainly one that our authors have enjoyed taking. I can't say not 100% of them, but the vast majority. And the ones who have been a bit hesitant, it's been very easy to describe why it's necessary. So on that note, I'll hand back to Porter, but I look forward to taking questions at the end.
Thank you, Stacey. You tickled me at a couple of points. I think it's wonderful to understand exactly what we don't understand. And this is what you're putting across in such a good way that we actually enjoy hearing about it and learning from it. So thank you for that. Melissa, help me with your last name. I don't want to mispronounce it.
Again.
Again.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Everyone mispronounces it.
Well, I'm sure I would have, so you've saved me, you see. No, I appreciate that. Melissa is with Kantuk Publishing, and she knows what to tell us about moving metadata, accessibility metadata through the value chain, because this is something we also have to think about. If it's born accessible, it needs the metadata, like everything needs metadata, right? To go correctly. Help us with this, Melissa. Let us know.
Thank you, Porter. So, hi everyone. My name is Melissa. I'm a product manager at Demark. Demark is a French-Canadian ebook distributor. We also sell books to libraries, ebooks and audiobooks. We also have an e-lending solution, and we have reading apps, Aldico, for those who know it. So we do many things, and my role at Demark is to make sure that our products and services dedicated to publishers evolve in the right way according to what their needs are, and how the market is evolving as well. So two of my favorite topics in my area of expertise are metadata and accessibility. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So metadata is really at the center of the book selling and reading experience. Over the last few years, many studies have been conducted that consistently show the impact that metadata can have on the level of discoverability of your book and their sales. The way that you write your summary, the categories that you assign to your books, the series that you document, the contributors, everything, all those metadata can help bookstores do their work and promote your books and increase their discoverability. With accessibility, it goes even deeper than that. If you have an accessible ebook and you don't document accessibility metadata, your ebook is not accessible, because a reader will never be able to find it. So if a reader is browsing through a website, a bookstore, and they want to find books that that fit their level of accessibility need, and we don't have those metadata, they will never find it. It will be invisible. So it's really, really important to provide those accessibility metadata to your distributor and to the booksellers. The ONIX standard allows you to do that, but we know that documenting metadata is already a lot of work for publishers, as it is, and accessibility metadata can sound very technical and can sound like more work. So I really think that it's a shared responsibility. As distributors, we have to help publishers with accessibility metadata. We have to help them understand what it is and distribute them in the right way to the resellers. So we've been trying to innovate a little bit in that field. And in the next few months, we want to start trying to document automatically the accessibility metadata of publishers' ebooks. So we are experimenting right now to do that. So what we would do is that we would use the EPUB files of the publishers, and from there we could automatically infer the accessibility metadata, because it's right there in the file, so we can help do that more automatically. So Demark, as a distributor, in the next few months and the next few years, what we want to do, in addition to helping publishers produce accessible files, we want to make them understand how accessibility metadata matters, the impact that it has on the final reader, and really find ways to help them give us those metadata more easily. So that's what we've been doing and what we'll do for a while, I think. Thank you.
great project. I like hearing about this because you also have your own experience of what's needed. And that's exactly what it takes. I think in starting end to end, we actually have people who know what they're doing, and that's good. That is the way to make it happen. I want to ask at this point, because before we get too deep into the session, I'd like to see if there are any questions coming up for you in the audience that you'd like to put to our panelists. Oh, good. Here's one. Yes, sir, on the front row, please.
Yes. We all been talking about the European Accessibility Act, June 2025. So
Right.
what will happen in July 2025 if the book is not accessible?
Very good question.
It depends of the legislation of different countries. You know, the directive is European directive. It should be implemented in national legislation. So every country should define who are the authorities who manage the monitoring of the implementation. And they could happen that there are fine if you are not compliant. So I think it's something that already happens for the web directive and for US for other legislation. It's quite new for European countries, and I think there will be some transition period, will be some support from the different national authority. We hope that the government will take very seriously the investment done by the publisher in this area and may support this. And this may happen. So it's something that you can, probably you will request to comply with the legislation, and if you don't comply, then could be some penalties.
That's a good question. What is the comeuppance if I'm not there on time? I get that. Thank you, Christina. Another question, please. Yes, please. Hi.
To have repeated the content that's written. Usually a lot of infographics are just visualizations of something that's written already in the text.
Shall I take this one?
Yes, thank you, Stacey.
Thank you. It's a good question.
It is good.
Infographic comes up a lot, infographics. So certainly what we don't want is duplication. And so, for example, if you are developing alt text, that's typically for a screen reader user. And so what will happen is, if you're looking at that particular page, say, or that infographic, a sighted person will not see the alt text behind that, but a screen reader user will hear it being read to them as they get to the graphic. And so what we don't want is, we don't want a description outside that graphic just to be then repeated within the graphic, because it's going to get really confusing as to, well, when am I in the graphic and when am I not, and why have they told me twice? So absolutely, I would say that if you have the description around it, I would still label that graphic, because if you don't, you might just, the screen reader is either going to just say nothing as it goes over it, and it's not going to pass the accessibility check, or it's going to say graphic, and then that's going to lead to confusion. So labeling it and saying, you know, this is, say, object 2.4 or whatever you want to call it, just making sure that it is called out by the screen reader, but if the description's already above it, then you don't need to include the alt text. I think as long as it's clear that that description is fully portraying what's in that infographic. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
Good. Thank you.
Very good question and a good answer. Thank you. Another question. Oh, I think I see a hand here. Mike is coming to you. It was right there for you. Thanks very much.
Hello, Ken Jones from Circular Software. Another question for Stacey. When you have a workflow for the authors to describe their images, which sounds like a good idea, do you also have a way for them? How do you ask for them to supply that? Is that metadata within the image itself, or is it like a spreadsheet, or is there any other sort of clever way that you ask them to actually provide that in a sort of structured way?
Thank you, Ken. Hi. It's a really good question. So it's something that we're working on at the moment. So at the moment, they provide us with that information and metadata via Excel. But we'd really like to look at more automated ways to increase the speed of that process. And it sort of depends. So for the authors some authors are very, au fait with providing their images now. And that process goes through really smoothly. And so they know how to submit their metadata. Again, typically just in Excel at the moment. But for other authors, when they're starting, quite often they'll need a bit of support from the editors at the beginning, and so they have to work with them to make sure that they know how to get that metadata across in Excel. But again, it's not ideal at the moment in my view, because it's not actually very searchable, it's not discoverable in that form. And so it's something that we are working on at the moment, is making sure that it's a smoother process, it's more aggregated, and it's more discoverable.
How about another question? There's a hand going up. These are very bright lights, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a very just practical question. You mentioned that you have all these helps and courses for people, for like publishing companies to make their books more accessible. I was just wondering if there's like actual courses I can take with you, or where would I find the information, because I wasn't sure how to find it after the talk.
You can look at the website of the foundation, and we publish the information of the course. We do different kind of course. We make a catalog of course that is open to everybody, and we also do a lot of consultancy and training specific for a single organization. And in this case, we define the content and the training courses with the company. So it's in-house training. So we have both. I can give you my card later. And just another information that I think may be useful for all of you. We have prepared a paper that describe more in detail all the implication of the European Accessibility Act. It can be freely downloadable from the website of the foundation under the resource tag. And if you are from Germany, you may also download the German version of the paper that has been adapted in collaboration with Börsenverein and DZB Lesen on the Börsenverein website. So, and if you wish, you can leave us your email, and then we can send more practical detail how to download and where.
And you're quite the mind reader, because Christina had just said in my ear, we have to tell them how to find the information. Your hearing is extremely good over there. Who else has a question? Here's one, and then we'll get yours too, don't worry.
In terms of making images accessible, is there any age differences, like for kids before they go to school? Should we make it accessible for their parents, or?
There is one information related with legislation that is important to know. One of the exceptions is that art book, comic books, and illustrated children books are exempt from the directive at the state of the art of accessibility. That means that now it's difficult to produce accessible version of this kind of books in digital version, and also the standard and the reading solution are not ready yet. So for the moment, you may not consider to make this digital version accessible. Probably in the future, as the technology evolves, this will change. So this is important to know.
Can I just add to that?
Yes.
So absolutely, you don't have to do it, but you can still do it. And so there will be no penalty if you do not do it, but it can be done. So I would still say, please, I would encourage you to describe, to put alt text and image descriptions for books for any person of any age, whether that's early literacy straight through to adulthood.
I think that's very wise, particularly today in so many of the sessions that I've been in. We're discussing the power of comics and manga, graphic novels. There's a great deal of energy right now around visually enhanced storytelling and purely visual storytelling. I think the silent picture books for children are quite interesting. So this is definitely a moment to make sure that if there is anything you can do it. And right now is a good moment for that.
And there is also a lot of research in the working group focused on accessibility also in this topic. Because it's important to, for example, have children who can read the same book as their friends. So, and it's important that consider that what we are speaking about is not just inclusion for entertainment, but is inclusion for work, for study, and for the life. So it's really, really important. Educational content, it's a more complicated solution, but we are now working with a lot of Italian publishers also in that area. So I think it's a process. It's not, everything is not set up, it's a journey, but you need to start.
It's quite a nice coincidence, too, that since we are speaking with Fondazione LIA and we're talking about the Italian purview on this, if you see him in the audience, I think he was here earlier, Stefano Amari is here, of the GEMS Corporation, and marvelous publisher, and he's very keen on how strong comics have become with the youth readership in Italy and the amazing connections they seem to make at times into non-comic literature, because they simply are drawn in by the comics they were interested in. Great movement, in other words, not to dwell on it, is happening in the comics arena right now. So this is an excellent question, and thank you. It needs to carry right over into accessible work. Now, remember we had a question over here. So, yeah, thank you.
I just had,
There's your mic.
yes, thank you. I have a quick question for Melissa regarding the metadata. Is there a standard for accessibility metadata that we can start working on?
Yes, there is. So as I was saying, you have the Onyx standard, that is the standard for books in general. There is a complete list of codes that are dedicated to accessibility, and there is another list when you can find other features that you can document. So I don't want to make a mistake. I will check and get back to you just after the meeting with the number of the list so that you can go and check, but it's the Onyx 3 standard that is the standard to use.
May I also add another element? For sure, the Onyx metadata are the most relevant for the distribution. There are other metadata where there is a working group that is working on, that is the library metadata, so MARC. And also in that case, the accessibility metadata is something that they are looking for, because it's another option for people to access the accessible books in a library loan service. So normally in library loan service, MARC is used more than Onyx, and so there is a working group working on harmonization of this standard. So I think this is important.
Yeah, there are some mappings between the two that, working groups work on. So I think for publishers, yeah, if you have Onyx and MARC, it's a really good start. There are other standards, but you don't need to worry about them right now.
Before we finish, we have just a couple of minutes. I'd like to ask our team here to give us a sense, too, of what kind of expense might be involved in this. Because we are talking about a leap for some who are not yet into born accessible and want to be and need to be and will have to be at a certain point in Europe. Is the process something that we can quantify in terms of what your expenses might look like? Is there a way to think about how this goes?
Yeah, I can start. Maybe, Christina, you can add to that.
Okay,
But
good.
I think that the level of effort and the costs that are related to that, there are two main factors. Like, there is the initial effort that you have to do when you start producing accessible ebooks. You have to adapt your workflow. because you want to be born accessible, right, for your new titles. So that requires effort at the start. Once it's done, it's integrated in your workflow, and it's really a mindset. You get used to working on alternative text, and it becomes something that's part of your publishing house culture. And then, of course, the level of complexity of your book will have an impact on the effort. But that is true also without accessibility. A complex book is always more complex to produce. It always takes more time. And yes, it's true with accessibility as well. But I think that, the big chunk of work is becoming born accessible. Once you've done that, you're quite good to go.
And I think accessibility means also innovation. And if you have in your country some funding for innovation, digitization, this kind of activity, or you may ask your government to put some funding on that, I think it's important. We have worked with some publishers, and they were able to recover part of the cost because they were able to apply some of the cost to some innovation process or project. So this is something that it could be relevant to know. And for sure, I think that at the level of European Publisher Association and also National Publisher Association, this is something that we are trying to support with a request for funding in this area for the publishing industry in view of 2025 and this investment.
And as we were saying, investment that it is, it's also broadening your potential revenue. So there's a good way to think about it, and to do a good test case yourself and see just what point you start actually meeting those expenses and starting to exceed them. A proud moment, I feel sure. I want to thank our guests who have been so articulate today on everything that we needed to know. Melissa and Stacy and Christina, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the moderation.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Porter.
Thank you. We also want to say thank you to Elisa from the foundation and to the foundation itself, the Italian publishers and the Blind Union in Italy for making all of this possible. Thank you again. Another session will be with us shortly. We hope you can stay with us and have a great rest of your first day here at Frankfurt. We're so glad you're here. Thank you again.